Alright guys, massive news in the Formula 1 world today with the next generation of regulations in the Formula 1 world being leaked to the public today. Loads of new information here, especially with regard to the downforce generated, reportedly 40% less downforce than next generation of cars will develop compared to what we currently have. Also, Andretti getting through the first process of approvals for their spot as the 11th team on the grid. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, nearly at 30k. Really appreciate all the support over the last few days. Firstly, before we get to the Andretti stuff, McLaren, their wind tunnel they've been gassing up for years at this point, is finally up and running. So they are very confident this is going to be the key step that's going to take them to the next level. And in fairness, they have made massive progress on this year's car without this brand spanking new wind tunnel they keep talking about. Now, in fairness, Red Bull's wind tunnel is from the Cold War, and they're obviously still working rather well, but maybe, Adrian Newey's mind does a lot of the calculations. So this is McLaren's brand new wind tunnel, and they're really excited about it, and they believe now it's up and running, it will help them considerably with next year's car. Of course, is already in the works and has gone a long way. Probably 2025, we might start to see some real impact of this. Now, Andretti, there's been lots of talk about Andretti recently, and for good reason. They seemed like the only reasonable candidate to get accepted as the 11th team on the Formula 1 grid. They seem like the perfect candidate. They have backing from Cadillac, General Motors. That's a big partnership. They've got sporting and racing heritage. They don't have any particularly, dodgy partners from certain regions around the world. So, maybe that's not what Formula 1 wants, given what's happening elsewhere. But nonetheless, they seem like the perfect candidate. The issue is whether commercially it works with Formula 1 management. So the FIA have gone through all the process and they have gone through all the applications. There was quite a few. Some of them were terrible and never going to go anywhere. Andretti's has been approved, and the FIA says this is good to go. You're good to join the grid. That is only the first step. It's not guaranteed yet. It now goes to the teams and Liberty Media Formula 1 management to decide on what this means commercially. The FIA, the governing body, have said, yep, they tick the boxes. They are a successful candidate in our books, and therefore they can join the grid. Now it's up to the teams and Formula 1 to say, all right, do we say yes or no? Now, I would have said, my belief was that they would just say no. The main reason being there's a pie, right? This pie is getting split currently between 10 teams. You bring in a new team, that pie is getting split 11 ways, which isn't as good. Now, obviously, Andretti could bring a lot of interest from the US. They could bring new sponsors. Of course, General Motors getting involved with Cadillac is big for the sport as well. So there's other benefits, and the teams have said, look, if there is going to be 11th team, they've got to show that they add value to the sport, which I think this, potential addition certainly would do. The other part, though, is they will have to pay some sort of money to compensate the teams for the slice of the pie that they're losing. And that number recently has been considered to be about $200 million. The issue is the sport has grown over the last few years, and the teams now want like $1 billion, maybe 600 million. I don't know. But they're drafting up a new Concord agreement and will come to some sort of number, I imagine. But even then, some of these teams won't be happy with this because they don't want any other team at all. And I would have said that probably they will just reject them outright because they don't want to split the pie any further. The problem is, though, apparently, especially in European Union law and European courts, once the FIA has said yes, the F1 management team, Liberty Media, the teams, have a very difficult time saying no. I think there's some sort of laws in place that mean that unless there's some sort of security risk from this addition, they really have to find, it's difficult to find a justification to say no, basically is what I'm trying to get at. And therefore, this is more likely than not, I think, to happen right now. It's not for sure at all. The FIA, though, says that they're happy with it, and their statement says, we note, actually F1 say, we note the FIA's conclusions in relation to the first and second phase of their process, and will now conduct our own assessment of the merits of the remaining application. On paper, it ticks all the boxes. Whether they can come up with the relationships they want, that's another question, but it's one further step towards an 11th team, and I think that, pretty much everyone in the sport, fans at least, want that to happen. The teams, there's been another question on. Now, the teams are also discussing the new rules come 2026 in terms of the regulations. This will be the biggest regulation overhaul in a very long time because, look, 2022 was a pretty big deal, but the engines were the same. This is probably an even bigger deal in terms of regulation overhaul, and they're changing the engines. And the engines are likely to be very important if the cars are slower, which it seems like they will be. So AMuS, very reliable source, come out with their analysis today on all the rumours as to what the cars are going to look like in 2026. And also you've got to already think which teams could benefit from this and which teams might not benefit from this. So we know about the engines, right? There was a big talk a while ago. Red Bull aren't happy about it. The rumour is that because Red Bull's engine development isn't going quite as well as Mercedes is or Honda's is, for example, that may not be true. It's just rumours. But we know that the engine currently generates 850 odd horsepower. That's the ICE, the internal combustion engine. The hybrid component generates about 160, something like that. Come 2026, it's going to be a 50-50 split. The battery is going to make up for a far higher percentage of the total power output than it currently does. Bigger battery also means more weight, right? The battery is going to be heavier, the engine, the drivetrain is going to be heavier than it previously was. We don't want more weight on these cars, and they will try and reduce it. That is the plan. So we've known about the stuff on the engine for some time. Then we believe they were initially targeting a 50 kilogram reduction in the weight of the car. It's currently 798, and as the article says, the current cars with 798 are already far too heavy for the purist, which I agree with, especially because they start the race with 100 kilos of fuel. That's a 900 kilogram car. Like, that is too heavy for me, given they used to be like 500 kg roughly not that many years ago at this point. Now, the other part of this, which I thought was fascinating, is that this battery is going to be massive and it's going to be really power hungry, obviously. It needs to be charged up somehow, and it won't just be able to be charged up through the MGU-K, which is generating force under braking. The MGU-H is no longer existing, by the way, so it can't recover any energy from the turbo. So the only energy recovered for the battery is through MGU-K, which is energy recovered under braking force, the kinetic part of the motor generator unit, or whatever exactly that stands for. So in order to compensate for this, they will use fuel to charge the battery. Out of the 100 kilos of fuel available to race, 30 kilos of that will just be used to charge up the battery. And it's like, what's even the point of having the battery if you're doing all this song and dance, oh, so, sustainable, we've got this electrical power, but actually you're using fuel to charge it up? Now, the fuel is sustainable, but it makes me think, why not, and this has been my preference, just get rid of this whole battery stuff. Let's just do a V10, or maybe a V8, V12, whatever you guys prefer, and let's just run it on sustainable fuel. It will be cheaper to do, it will be probably more sustainable, arguably, than the batteries, but that's not what they're doing yet. That would be my preference, but that's not going to happen for the immediate term. But the other part is, how light is the car going to be? The plan is to reduce the kgs by 50 kg, but of course the drivetrain is already more heavy with the changes they're making with the bigger battery, so that's going to be a challenge. The intention is 20 kg, so to go from 798 to something like 778, which is a step in the right direction. It's not as much as I would like in terms of weight reduction, but it's a possibility. And there's also big rumours that they might straight up abandon the minimum weight. This is actually a really interesting idea, because that 798 or whatever it is now is the minimum weight. You can't actually go below that. And you guys remember at the start of 2022, Alfa Romeo had not a particularly good car aerodynamically, but it was right on the weight limit. Red Bull were actually quite considerably over, but they had better aero. So there was a bit of a trade-off there at the start of last season when Alfa looked good at the start of 2022, but only because they were lightest. So there's another argument that says, well, how about you allow teams to do whatever they want? No minimum weight, go as light as you can. Now, you've got to wonder at some point, and even as they mentioned in the article, with certain components in the suspension, then if you have too lightweight constructions, there will be defects in play, there will be errors, and, do we really want drivers' suspensions to be snapping at 200 miles an hour just because they're targeting as low a weight as possible? Maybe not, but, well, they say in the article, a little more unpredictability would do the sport good. So I'm kind of down for this within reason. Then though, we get to the other key changes to the dimensions of the car, and people generally want the cars to be more nimble. They want them to look like, at least I want them to look like, maybe you guys disagree, but I want them to look like they did back in, 2005, 2006, years like that, when they were super agile, nimble. Those are some of the best seasons to watch the cars be driven. It felt like Formula 1 as far as I'm concerned, those kind of few years stretch in the late 2000s, but they're trying to shrink the car. So currently they're they're 2 meters wide. I mean, these cars are immense. 2 meters wide. They're going to go from 200 centimeters down to 190 centimeters. The wheelbase will be shortened from 360 centimeters down to 340, potentially 330. So that'd be a 10 centimeter width reduction, a 20 centimeter length reduction, and they reckon that maybe 330, but teams aren't so happy with this. Now, the other part of this, of course, is if you reduce the size of the car and make some other changes to the way the aero works, and this is a major aero overhaul as well. Rumour has it that active aerodynamics are going to return, so, literally pieces of the car. Okay, the only active aero we have in F1 is DRS. Apparently DRS is going to go, but there's going to be alternatives. And the analysis says downforce will be reduced by 40%, which is considerable, and despite what is said later in the paragraph, which maybe is just in terms of straight line speeds, if you've got 40% less downforce, the cars are going to be significantly slower than they are presently. I mean, that is simply how it works. And that's a pretty big deal. And before we go into that in more detail, I just wanted to mention that overtaking is going to become easier without artificial aids like DRS, because there's a concept change that they haven't really talked about yet, and there's rumours that it's something to do with active aero that is changing. It's not exactly DRS, you open the flap, you go faster. It's more like some other changes. If the car's close behind you, you start to lose downforce, some weird thing like this. But the belief is it's going to be much easier to follow another car, and this is another benefit of reducing the downforce. The less downforce, the better the racing, in theory. I mean, the best racing you can find in the world really is, supercars or like karting, stuff like this, when, there's no downforce, it's just mechanical grip. So there's no dirty air, really. There's a bit of a slipstream, but there's not a major effect, and it creates great racing. But there's a middle ground, obviously, because you want the cars to be fast, you want them to race well. So there's a balance there. 40% downforce reduction sounds like an awful lot. And there's a few issues with this, right? Because the cars are going to be the same weight, within reason. Okay, a bit lighter and a bit smaller and a bit thinner and probably a bit more agile. But, they will be pretty much the same weight. So 40% less downforce. Now, the engineers will put that back on, it probably won't take long after these regulations are announced for the teams to get to only 30% less, only 20% less. You know how it is. Adrian Newey's probably looking at this thinking, well, maybe I'll call it 10% for the Red Bull that we create. So one thing you might say is that, well, if, downforce is getting reduced considerably, then the success of the engine department, which we really don't know who's going to do the best job, is of massive importance, which it is anyway, to be honest, as it was at the start of 2014 when Mercedes nailed the turbo hybrid era out of the gates. But one other thing I would mention is in terms of tyre degradation. We know that higher downforce means less tyre degradation. You can go around a circuit. There's pros and cons to using higher or lower downforce. Higher downforce, better in the corners, slower on the straights, right? That's obvious enough. But also, higher downforce means that on the straights, you reach less top speed. Therefore, when you brake for a corner, you are going from a lower top speed to a higher minimum speed for the corner, and your braking zone is shorter than if you're on lower downforce. Therefore, you generate less energy recovery in the braking zone. And because your car is harder to push through the air, you also use more battery. So higher downforce also equals less battery recovery. But one of the other benefits of higher downforce is better tyre wear. The tyres wear when they slide around under the car. And the more downforce you have, the less the tyres slide in corners, on exits, stuff like this. Therefore, the less they wear. And if we have a lot of tyre degradation now and a lot of tyre management now, which we do, then reduction in downforce with the same weight cars is going to make that even worse. I mean, I already am not a big fan of the fact that we do probably 3 laps of racing at the start of a Grand Prix, and then everyone just settles into formation and just does tyre saving for the next 30 laps. It's basically how it goes sometimes, because the tyres do degrade, but instead of pushing them max out and doing 3 or 4 stops, it's faster just to manage the tyres. And there's some skill in that, but it's not as fun as watching the guys absolutely go hell for leather every single lap as they used to, 20 years ago or so, when the tyres didn't really degrade. But there were pit stops still for fuel. So, I don't know, that's something they'll have to think about, because if you're going to have less downforce with the same weight cars, then the tyres are going to degrade faster, which could be good, right? It could mean we get loads of stops, but it also could mean that tyre management is just everything, which I'm not necessarily sure that we want. And just to kind of show you guys, actually, in terms of sizes of the cars, they were pretty static from the 70s to the 90s. Started to get a bit bigger in 2007 or so, but even that was pales in comparison to the size of the cars today. 2019, they've been pretty similar the last few years. And yeah, they're going to get slightly smaller, slightly thinner, but it's not going to be, not going to be quite what it was back in the day, which is okay if they get the aero department right, which is still a massive question as it stands. Now, just before we close out, I did want to mention, speaking of tyre degradation, it was a massive problem during the first Qatar Grand Prix we had back in 2021. We had Russell getting a puncture, we had Bottas getting a puncture, and that was this screenshot right here. Last time we went there, of course, Hamilton took pole. Really, probably underrated pole up, actually, because I think he had 4.5 tenths on the field, purple on that day, obviously in the midst of that title fight at the time. This is the track as well. And it's a phenomenal circuit. I know people think, Jeddah, Qatar, maybe the circuits aren't as good, but I think this track is great. Now, it's not necessarily going to be great for overtaking. That is one issue. But for qualifying, man, you've got to watch the Saturday for this because it's a spectacular track. So anyway, really the best section is Sector 3 with this 12, 13, 14 complex. Fast right-handers. Hamilton was going flat out in the W12 through these 3 corners, which was immense, and it is a very high downforce circuit, probably maximum downforce. That is going to mean that DRS is more powerful, but during the inaugural race in 2021, the only overtakes that were really done were into turn 1. You get the big DRS down the straight, overtake into turn 1, stay ahead, because dirty air is going to be big through these corners, and this is the type of track that could be considerably helped if these regulations are true, that they actually will reduce the dirty air effect and help that, because lower downforce equals lower dirty air equals easier to follow, which was theoretically the case in 2022 and was the case in 2022 by the numbers, but as now, as downforce has been added on, significantly reduced. So, it's going to be difficult to follow around here. It's going to be difficult to overtake around Qatar. Qualifying's probably going to be great. That, of course, is actually on Friday. I said Saturday, but yes, qualifying Friday because Saturday's the sprints, and well, actually 2 qualifying sessions, right? Because I'll do the additional quali for the sprint. You guys know how it goes now, and then the race on Sunday. They also are bringing the hardest tyre compound set. So, well, I think there's also the C0, isn't there? But they're not really using that anymore. So yeah, C1, C2, C3, pretty much the hardest tyre set. The track has been resurfaced. They don't really know what to expect from the degradation. Pretty much it was a 2-stop last time out. That's what that's what Verstappen did. That's what Hamilton did on that day. I think Alonso 1-stops, didn't need to get the podium. So it can be done, but we've only seen one evidence of that before. So yeah, that's all the updates for today. Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.